All right, this morning we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We have a lot to cover. We have spent the last couple of weeks spending a good deal of time on the end of chapter 6, and the beginning of chapter 7 really connects to what we've been talking about. But as we said at the end of last class, we spent a good deal of time talking about some of the negative side of things, how we can, what we should do to avoid sexual temptation. But what we're going to do in the beginning of chapter 7 is see that God has given to us this privilege of marriage, this opportunity, this blessing, as something that is kind of on the positive end of that spectrum, to say it's not don't, avoid, but here is an opportunity for you. Namely, as you look at verse number 9, that Paul says it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Although we would say that marriage is obviously certainly not limited to that, and the sexual relationship that exists within marriage is not simply for the purpose of avoiding sexual immorality, but it is certainly part of one of the blessings of marriage. And so what we'll do is we'll break the class this morning into three parts. We'll say that the purpose of marriage is found, as we might say, in verses 1 through 9. Again, we wouldn't say that this is an all-encompassing text on the purpose of marriage, but certainly in the context of what we've been talking about the past couple of weeks, we find that there is a very important purpose in marriage, and that there are some guidelines, that there are some expectations, there are some recommendations that are given by the Apostle Paul in this section. Then we'll move on to verses 10 through 16 and talk about the permanence of marriage. And then finally, we'll look at Paul's perspective on marriage in verse 17 through the end of the chapter. And so let's consider, as we said, we've got a lot to cover this morning. Drew's teaching next week, and so he's scheduled to start teaching chapter 8. So we're going to try to cram as much of this in as we can. If you have questions at the end for me later on, didn't spend time enough covering something, feel free, please, to ask, to reach out. And so let's talk first about the purpose of marriage, at least in the light of this context. Let's talk about verses 1 and 2, that marriage guards against immorality. It seems that, at least if you look at all of chapter 7 in light of this particular thought, that it might have been the case that the Corinthians, because of the culture in which they lived, they saw sexual immorality rampant. It abounded among their culture. And so it seemed that maybe some Corinthians possibly were asking the question, well, should we abstain from sexuality at all, completely? Because, in other words, they looked at it maybe as sometimes some Christians might have gained an unintentional thought about sexuality as though it is something that's dirty, something that if you are engaged in it, you are doing something that is wrong. But as Paul says here, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. He says, concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. You could read that either from the perspective of he is saying, it's not you don't have the liberty or the license as a man to touch a woman unless you are, as he goes on to talk about, within the bounds of marriage. But you can also look at it from this perspective, that as they have been maybe wondering, maybe this is them saying it is good for a man not to touch a woman, and that they're thinking that is more holy, that is more a higher calling, as it were, to not indulge themselves in this. But he says, goes on to say, nevertheless, verse number 2, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. That doesn't mean that marriage is only to avoid the sin of sexual immorality, but it does serve that purpose. And we would go back again, we've alluded to this a number of times, Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 and 24, that in the very beginning, God saw that it was not good that man should be alone, and that a man should leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two should become one flesh. And this one flesh is not just simply a physical thing, a physical union, but there's also an emotional component, as well as a spiritual and even a covenantal, as you might say, component to this. That there is God now joining these two individuals together, that this covenant, this union exists between two individuals, but also God is there present in that particular that particular covenant, that particular union. And so God designed marriage as both protection, in the sense that it helps to protect you from engaging in sexual immorality, but especially also companionship. And so you would see purity and partnership there being something that we might allude to marriage being in totality. Last week we talked about how fire within a home, so long as it is within the fireplace, within the hearth, that it is something that is good. It warms the house. But when that fire leaves the fireplace, when it leaves the hearth, obviously there is great problem that arises from that. It is destructive. In a very similar sense, again, we would say that the sexual relationship within the appropriate bounds of marriage is good. It is something that God has designed. It is something that God has given us license to engage in. But when we use it outside of that boundary, as it were, it becomes that which is destructive. And so what Paul wants them to see here is that they shouldn't treat marriage as something that is less than, or they shouldn't treat sexuality as something that is inappropriate or unnecessary, but rather that Paul is saying to them, this is something that is given to you as a blessing. And so, by the way, verse number 2, you might take note of the fact that Paul, once again, just like Jesus did in Matthew chapter 19, we'll talk about Matthew 19 more here as we get later on in this chapter, but just as Jesus talked about a man should leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, so too does Paul here say very specifically that a man is to have his wife and a woman is to have her own husband. There is a very specific authorization here. Again, confirming that what has always been the case from the very beginning is that a marriage, a covenant bond that exists between two individuals it has always been the case that God expects that to be between a man and a woman. We didn't spend a lot of time at all really talking about the different words that you find in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. There's a lot of debate in the original language about, well, what does this particular word mean in reference to homosexuality? Is this referring to individuals that are the dominant abusers or almost using it from a prostitution standpoint? But even if all of those were somewhat nuanced and you couldn't come to a conclusion just based on those words that homosexuality is not authorized in God's word, very clearly there is an expectation just by what is commanded, just by what is expected, that a man should have a wife, here found in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse number 2. It automatically excludes any other alternatives. And so don't worry about maybe the confusion or the understanding of certain Greek words in that particular case. Back in chapter number 6, Paul continues and reaffirms what is said over and over again throughout all of the Bible, that has always been the case. One man, one woman for life, and we're going to talk about that part later on in the class this morning. But going on to verses 3 and 4, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And so we would see that it guards against sexual immorality, but it requires what we might call mutual giving. They are to render affection to one another. That is to say, there is an obligation between a husband and a wife to one another. This isn't a cold duty. This isn't something that is just, okay, I have to do it, but rather it is the giving of love. Again, there's this physical, this emotional, and a spiritual connection here because of the covenantal bond of marriage. And so when he says, render to his wife the affection due her, and vice versa, the wife due to her husband, this is the same word that you would find in the original language connected to debts that are owed to other individuals from a financial standpoint. And so it's not just that someone, when they want, one partner in the marriage wants to be engaged in sex and the other does not, there's this expectation, this understanding that they are owed that. Not because they're using the other individual, but there is that rendering of affection. There's an obligation there that is part of the covenantal bond of marriage. And so there is mutual consent and mutual authority over one another. And so, as we said, it's not just a one-way street, it's a two-way street. But then as you move into verse number 5, Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you. Funny little story to maybe bring some levity to a few weeks of some heavy topics here. When I don't recall the age, honestly, okay? I was responsible for giving some devotional thought when I was younger, just trying to think about, and my topic that I came up with was unity. And thank God that my mother looked over my notes before I presented that particular devotional, because I had chosen 1 Corinthians 7 verse 5, that brothers in Christ should have unity and they should come together again. Not looking at the context of all of chapter 7. That's not what this is talking about. And so as a lesson, always look at the context of what you're reading and what verse you want to use. Otherwise, lest you use it for something that has nothing to do with what you're talking about. This is talking about a sexual union. And they should not, a husband and wife should not deprive one another of that, except when there is mutual consent. That is for a purpose. We have chosen, there's a mutual agreement, both are agreeing here. And it is a temporary amount of time. It's not a permanent thing. And it is purposeful. So it's mutual, temporary. It's purposeful that they have agreed that this will be for a time, but it's serving a purpose for maybe prayer and devotion. But then notice the end. Come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. In marriage, okay, the enemy, even in marriage, looks for cracks that he might be able to get in and find a wedge to be able to place a wedge between the two of you. And so as we think about all of these things, in marriage, spiritual life and physical life are not at odds with one another. They are meant to harmonize. They are meant to come together in that sense. And so as faithful Christians, as married Christians, we ought to recognize that there is an expectation to submit to this authority that is given to each spouse in that particular relationship. But let's also notice verses 6 through 9. This word about celibacy and self-control. Okay? First, notice verse number 6. Paul is saying this as a concession, not as a commandment. He is not commanding one or the other, that is marriage or celibacy. He is recognizing that there are different circumstances for different individuals. But he says in verse number 7 that singleness, in a sense, could be looked at as a gift. Why does he say that? He says, I wish that all men were even as I myself. He says, I wish all men were even as myself. What is he referring to? He's referring to the fact that he himself was a single man. He says, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. And so you might look at, as Paul did, singleness not as something that was lacking or had a deficiency in his life, but rather as an opportunity. What is he referring to here? Well, you can look down at the end of the chapter, because we're not probably going to make it if I'm honest with myself, at verses 32 through 35. And he wants them to understand that a single individual has a great opportunity for the ministry. That is to say, the single individual has an opportunity to glorify God in circumstances that maybe married individuals do not share, because they do not have, as Paul refers to, maybe the cares of the world connected to as marriage does. And so as you think about a husband having responsibility to render affection to his wife and see to her concerns and needs, and the wife likewise, a single individual is not going to be distracted. Not because that word distracted is being used in a negative sense, but rather a single individual doesn't have those extra cares and responsibilities on their plate to tend to another individual. You think about missionaries. You think about maybe people that are in the ministry that might have thought about going into the mission field, foreign mission field, but because of their familial responsibilities, both to their wife and maybe to their children, that is a hindrance to that potential opportunity. It's not to say that they can't do good where they are. Many preachers, myself included, serving in a local work, are able to do good, right, as a married individual, but so often it can be the case that a marriage can be a hindrance to maybe other opportunities in the ministry. And so he's saying here, look, it's an opportunity, it's not a deficiency. And so you could even go back again to Matthew chapter 19. Again, we'll refer to this once more in the future. But Jesus says, some have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Okay, in other words, for the very purpose of the ministry, for the very purpose of God's kingdom, some have chosen to remain celibate. Okay. However, having said all of that, he circles back around and gives another point of wisdom about all of this. He says it is good for them to marry. It is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. And so God provides, again, he reemphasizes that God is providing an opportunity, an avenue for individuals to avoid sexual immorality. To sum it all up, it's important to emphasize this, that within the bounds of marriage, this is something that God has authorized and God sees as good, because there are some that see marriage and the sexual relationship simply as a means for procreation, that is the only need, that is the only purpose of sexual relationship within a marriage, that is to say that they are to be fruitful and multiply, as they might turn back to Genesis. But as you see here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, very clearly, there is also the added element of the relationship that exists between a husband and a wife, and also the prevention of sexual immorality as it is used properly. So we've considered first the purpose of marriage. Now let's consider from verses 10 through 16 the permanence of marriage. And in order to do so, as we consider the permanence of marriage, let's turn back to Matthew 19 for just a brief time. It is always good to see the big picture, not to look just at one particular section of Scripture, but to also compare it to what it says in other places. We could look at Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 9, or we could also look at Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, or Luke chapter 16, verse number 18. But what I want us to see, at least very quickly, we don't have time to really break down this passage in depth, but in verses 3 through 9, the Pharisees come and they ask, is it unlawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Okay, but Jesus said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? So Jesus is pointing back to the very beginning of creation. And again, as we emphasized earlier, he's very clearly pointing out there is a male and a female in this relationship. He says, for this reason, a man, verse 5, shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. And they said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? But he said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, verse 9 is a very important verse. If you've tuned out, tune back in. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. We said through verse 9, but it's also important to take notice of verse 10, because I believe it helps us to understand the emphasis of Jesus' teaching here. His disciples said to him, if such is the case for the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. In other words, they viewed this as a difficult teaching. They viewed this as something that was serious in nature. So I want us to at least take away from this section three things. I guess I didn't put those on the screen. Number one, marriage is a divine union. God has joined these two individuals together, and man should not separate them. And so as you think about Jesus rooting marriage in the fact that God is doing the joining, he's saying that when two become one flesh, there's something it's not just a contractual agreement that's on paper that the state recognizes, but rather that there's also something there that is sacred and divine even. That God is involved in this relationship that is now taking place, and it is permanent. It's not just a social contract or a legal partnership. It's a covenant that God has witnessed and is involved in its binding as well. So to tear it apart, is not just dissolving a relationship. It's going against what God has authorized and what God has deemed as permanent. And so marriage is a divine union. God is involved, but also divorce is not part of God's original plan. Jesus is quoting all the way back from Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. And he does say divorce appeared as a concession, but that was not the design. That was not the purpose. From the beginning, it was not so. And so Jesus acknowledges that, but then he establishes firmly in verse number 9 that there is only one explicit exception for an individual to divorce and then remarry, and that is for marital unfaithfulness, or what we might call fornication. He says, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And so this is the one thing that is, quote unquote, powerful enough to separate this union that God has established. Even then, nowhere in this particular text do you find Jesus saying that a command is that a divorce is required, but rather that he permits it, that he allows it because of human failings in this particular case. But this is the only exception. So we bring that up because now, this is why it's not there. I forgot I was going to say, let's look at these 4 up here on the screen. Okay, we're going to remember Jesus' teaching. We're going to examine Paul's teaching. Then we're going to, based on those 2, establish some conclusions and then address some challenges to this teaching. And so, as we said, marriage is a divine union. Divorce was not God's original design. There's one explicit exception, but now let's consider number 2. Let's examine Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter number 7. So go back there with me. 1 Corinthians chapter number 7. Let's read verses 10 through 16. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? All right, so I first want us to take notice of the fact that Paul has divided this particular section into really kind of two categories. First, he gives a word to believers that are married to believers. And then he gives also a word to believers who are married to unbelievers. So in verses 10 and 11, he's talking specifically to believers who are married to other believers, Christians who are married to other Christians. But then in verses 12 through 16, he's talking to specifically individuals who are married to individuals who are unbelievers, who are not Christians. And so in verses 10 and 11, Paul is reaffirming what Jesus already taught. Believers are not to divorce one another. This is a permanent union. This is something that God designed to be for life. And if separation does occur, divorce does occur, it's the remarriage that comes about as a result of that afterwards. The only reason for that divorce should be for sexual immorality, and the only one who can remarry in that case would be the one who is the innocent party. And so if separation does occur, the one who departs must remain unmarried or, as he says, be reconciled. And so even if this separation happens, Paul is saying this marriage still exists. This marriage, from God's perspective, as having joined these two together, even though you're not living together maybe in the same house, God expects you to reconcile as believers, specifically in this particular case. But what about to the unbeliever in verses 12 through 16? Paul is now giving a different situation. I want to preface this by saying Paul is not changing anything that Jesus has already taught, but he's giving maybe more clarification to individuals who are now maybe in a marital relationship that maybe they weren't sure about what they should do in it. And so what you might call a mixed marriage here between a believer and an unbeliever. Okay, Paul says, if the unbeliever is willing to stay, the believer should remain in that marriage. But if the unbeliever departs, that is, he deserts or she deserts the marriage, the believer, Paul says, is not under bondage in such cases. Okay, he says, God has called us to peace. He doesn't desire, Paul says, and I believe he's by implication saying that God also is saying and desires that you shouldn't have to be in constant turmoil or forced cohabitation with someone who doesn't want to live with you. Now, doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to keep that union. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do all that you can within your power. But what Paul is saying here to the individual who is the believer, when an unbeliever departs, he's saying you are not under bondage. Now let's explore that a little bit more. The phrase "not under bondage," and also the phrase "the unbelieving is sanctified." Okay, so as we said, marriage is permanent until death, as you look towards even the end of this chapter, and also Romans chapter 7 would teach this as well. It continues, this marital bond does, unless it is broken by sexual immorality. Even though maybe the civil courts or the law of the land might say you're divorced, okay, God wants this marriage to be in persistence, in existence beyond that. And so, again, the only biblical ground for divorce and remarriage is sexual immorality. And Jesus' teaching stands as the controlling principle in all of this. Paul's not changing. He's not introducing a new exception. And so when he says not under bondage, the phrase means the believer is not bound to force or maintain that marriage against the unbeliever's will. In other words, the unbeliever leaves and the believer chases after them and says, no, I'm living with you. You have no choice in the matter. This is going to continue happening. Our marriage continues to exist. However, okay, just because you are not bound in a slavery sense to follow after them, that does not mean that they are free to remarry. There's nowhere in the text that it explicitly says, okay, if they leave, well, you're free to remarry. It just says you're not under bondage. And so Paul is granting freedom from what we might call enslavement. He's not granting the creation of a new marriage. And so we would ask the question, why does Paul group these two individuals or two groups into two different categories? If neither has the freedom to remarry, why separate them at all? And I would put it this way. Because ultimately it all comes back to Paul assuming that Christians will behave like Christ, even in a marital relationship that has problems within it. Paul expects that Christians will see the error of their ways in separating, and that they will choose to do the right thing and to reconcile with one another. Whereas in the situation with a believer and an unbeliever, Paul, he has no authority or influence over the life of the unbeliever, and that is to say they haven't chosen to follow Christ, and so therefore they have the right to go and leave. He can't demand that they stay, although that would be the ideal. That would be God's expectation. Okay, they're not followers of Christ, they're unbelievers. And so because he has no authority in the sense to force them to stay, as he would maybe with a Christian relationship, those that are believers, in this particular case, he separates them into those two groups. Okay, then the last part there, the one that's on the screen, what is the phrase, the unbelieving is sanctified? What are we talking about? What is Paul referring to here? Sanctified, we'll establish it from the outset. In this particular text, in this context, doesn't mean that the unbeliever, because he's married to a believer, is automatically saved. Okay, you have to, again, keep in context of the whole Bible, what are the other teachings of God's word about how an individual becomes a Christian, how an individual becomes in a right relationship with God. And so Paul is not teaching that marriage to a Christian automatically converts an unbeliever or saves them. Paul is using this word sanctified, okay, in a covenantal, relational sense. That is, he's talking about that particular marriage is sanctified, it is set apart. Not that that individual that is an unbeliever in that marriage is now saved, but rather that that particular marriage is set apart from other marriages. What does he mean by that? Why is he saying that? Well, what he's referring to here is that because you stay, okay, as a believer, and maybe going back to the question, maybe the question that a Corinthian would have here if he's married or she's married to an unbeliever, well, since I'm now a Christian, is it best for me to stay in this relationship? Should I stay in it? Because why would I be connected to someone? Why should I be connected? Is it best for me to be connected to someone who really doesn't want anything to do with God? And so the question is, should I stay in that relationship? Well, Paul here indicates that there is very much a reason to stay in that relationship because that marriage is set apart from other marriages in the sense that the other marriages of unbelievers, two unbelievers married together, there's a difference there. Whereas here, this marriage is separate. It's set apart from those. That word sanctified just means set apart. And so what they're set apart for in that sense is that there is an opportunity for the believer to influence the unbeliever. And so staying in that marriage is not only authorized, but it is looked at as good. It's looked at as a productive thing. It can be. Because Paul says to them, the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children. See, how do you know, verse 16, how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? You might look to 1 Peter chapter number 3 and see that the wife that is married to an unbelieving husband has an opportunity. And I can venture to say that many of you have seen this in the lives of others that you're connected to. That a woman who lives a meek and humble and quiet life and continues to stay married to her husband over the years has had an opportunity to have an impact on him and even convert him to Christ. And so Paul is not, what he's doing here, he's saying you can't, not only can you stay in that marriage, but it is a good thing for you to stay in that marriage such that, right, the unbeliever is amenable to that, is willing to stay. And so in case the believer was wondering whether they were allowed to stay in the marriage, Paul settles that matter. And he says the sanctification provides biblical grounds. In other words, the thought that it could produce a new follower of Christ by you staying in that marriage, it is something that God can use to convert the unbelieving spouse. And so that's what he's referring to here. Now, moving quickly, let's establish some conclusions based upon all of this. Again, we would notice the fact that the marriage bond is permanent. There's no change here from what Jesus taught to what Paul has been teaching. Among believers and unbelievers alike, the covenant remains intact even if they separate, unless there is that biblical ground from Matthew chapter 19 for divorce that is in sexual immorality. So we said there's one exception, sexual immorality. And then they are not enslaved, but there is no permission given to remarry. And I want to emphasize this very, very forcefully, as it were. Some have used this particular text from 1 Corinthians chapter 7 to allege that Paul has now given a new privilege, or sometimes called the Pauline privilege, that there is an additional exception that is given here. But I would submit to you that in the first place, because Paul has separated these two groups in a marriage that has two believers and a marriage that has an unbeliever and a believer, number one, Paul commands and says very explicitly that in a marriage between believers, that if they separate, if there's division among them, that they are to reconcile, okay? That is God's desire, that's Paul's desire, that's Paul's teaching, that's God's teaching. He wants them to reconcile, okay? There's a difference, admittedly, between that and the one with the believer and the unbeliever. However, again, there is nothing explicitly stated within this particular text, okay, that says that they are free to remarry. It just says they're not under bondage. They don't have to be a slave and continue to force that marriage between those two individuals. And so when we think about all of this, there needs to be consistency in our interpretation of this particular text. We can't create two standards, one that is strict for believers but more lenient for unbelievers, or an individual that is married to an unbeliever. And so to preserve the integrity of our interpretation, we've got to apply the same principle. Remarriage is permitted only on the grounds of a divorce that came about as a result of sexual immorality. And so someone might challenge that, okay? Before we do that, I want to emphasize this. This is a hard teaching. This isn't something that is necessarily an easy pill to swallow. It is one that, again, going back to Matthew chapter 19, the reaction of the disciples to Jesus' teaching there was one that was kind of a shock that they heard this. And so when we're teaching this, we need to help people understand that, again, just like we talked about with regard to different things with regard to sexual immorality last couple of weeks, we're not trying to establish rules and guidelines to be strict and rigid because we just want to have the control and power over certain things, but rather we just want to say, what does the Bible say? What does God's word teach? And just stick with that because God's wisdom is the best. But we need to do it with compassion, absolutely, because there are real people that are involved in these situations and a lot of hurt and deep wounds that are connected to these things. But we simply have to remain connected to the truth, no matter how difficult and no matter how painful it can be from time to time. But moving on, let's address some challenges to this teaching. As we said, does Paul give an extra reason for divorce? For divorce in this particular case of between a marriage, in a marriage that is between a believer and an unbeliever? Again, you might say that some people look at that phrase, not under bondage, as freedom to remarry. They would say that's what Paul is saying here. Because it says not under bondage, that allows them to break free from that marital bond and move on to someone different. But that reading conflicts with verse number 11. Even if she does depart, okay, this is talking to the married individuals that are, the believing individuals, both are believing, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And so if one accepts this interpretation, that there is a new grounds for remarriage, it must be, okay, emphasizing this very importantly, it must be strictly limited to abandonment by an unbeliever. Understand? Some would say 1 Corinthians 7 allows individuals, if they're deserted or abused, to remarry because of that situation. If that's the case, even if that's the case, it would be strictly limited to a marriage that existed between an unbeliever and a believer, okay? Because very explicitly in verse number 11, Paul says that a marriage that exists between two believers, they should reconcile. He's not giving any new ground here. But again, as we mentioned, there's no reason to even believe that phrase, not under bondage, means anything more than that they are not enslaved to maintain the relationship against the unbeliever's will. It doesn't mean that they're free to remarry. It doesn't say that anywhere in the text. That's reading into the text there, if someone were to suggest that. And so, again, to make this clear, there's two different marriages here, two believers, and over here, an unbeliever and a believer. Even if you were to say that Paul is making an additional concession here, it would only be for a marriage that was between a believer and an unbeliever. And so I would ask, when people turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and they're trying to make an additional concession for marriages that ended in divorce as a result of anything other than sexual immorality, are they being consistent with that? Are they saying, well, yes, they can remarry, but only if that original marriage was between a believer and an unbeliever? And I would submit that most often that's not the case. Usually it is being looked into this text as another opportunity to find, well, what about an abusive relationship? What about someone who deserts them? Do they really have to remain unmarried the rest of their life? And so Again, that's the next question. What about an abusive relationship? I will say, Scripture never commands a believer to remain in physical danger, to just sit there and to take the abuse. It certainly, 1 Corinthians 7 does uphold the permanence of marriage, but it also condemns violence and oppression and cruelty. And separation for safety is certainly a legitimate choice. Abuse would be a form of breaking of the covenant. And so, yes, that is a form of abuse or a separation, an abandonment, as it were. But again, we can't, just because of our heart's feeling for someone that is in a situation like that, add to the text that would suggest that there is now a new grounds for remarriage. And so oftentimes this passage itself becomes subject to abuse in the sense that many like to broaden Jesus' teaching. They will, I thought I had one more on the screen. They will do things like make extra exceptions for different situations, but they miss out on the opportunity that is found in verse number 16. Again, that there's an opportunity in that relationship because that marriage is sanctified, because that marriage provides an opportunity for that unbelieving spouse to potentially be converted. They miss out on that opportunity. I would submit that oftentimes, as we said, this passage is abused in the sense that people will turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 to use it as a text that justifies divorces that are basically no-fault divorces, as our society more and more is okay with and recognizes as no big deal. We have to, as God's people, reaffirm the permanence of marriage. We have to, as God's people, reaffirm that there is one exception for a divorce and for that innocent party to then be remarried because of that, and certainly not the guilty party. Obviously, we don't have the time, the minute remaining, but I would say that verses 17 through 24, whether you are married or a widow or unmarried, whatever the case, all of this text here really emphasizes that Paul wants them to recognize that in whatever circumstance you're in, whatever situation you're in, you have an opportunity to glorify God. And so don't think that you have to change one way or another to do something different in those relationships. You don't have to be married to be more spiritual. You don't have to be single to be more spiritual, but rather glorify God in every situation you're in. And I just honestly just don't have the time to consider that last section there to give it its due. But if you want some notes from that section, I'm happy to give those to you. But thank you for your attention this morning.